let's go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for being here, and folks who are joining us online through the live stream. Glad to have you too. My name is Dave Buckley. I'm the Paul Weber Endowed Chair of Politics, Science, and Religion here in the Political Science Department, and also direct the Center for Asian Democracy. And we're so glad to today have with us Professor Erin Lin from The Ohio State University. We didn't actually talk about whether you have strong opinions about the being there, but I'll be diplomatic. I'll introduce Professor Lin in just a minute, but first want to take a minute to thank Emily, Andrew, Grace, Sophia, Samantha, Anthony, and all the great folks who helped to make these events happen, and always appreciate that support from the CAD team. As always, we'll have our talk, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A in the room. That will run pretty smoothly through the microphone, so I will pass around the microphone during Q&A. That's because we want to be able to record your questions so that when Erin gives an answer, we know what she's giving an answer to, right? So we'll pass the mic around in the room. If anyone's online and wants to ask a question, there is a chat that we can keep an eye on, and you can feel free to add that question in the chat at any time during the talk. All right, so without any further ado, Erin Lin is Associate Professor of Political Science at The Ohio State University, and she's going to talk with us mostly today about her fantastic, relatively new book, When the Bomb Stopped, The Legacy of War in Rural Long-Term Consequences on Economics and Development and Politics in Cambodia and more generally. She especially seeks to, in her research, write to recover a more dynamic appreciation for the historical processes that shape contemporary development, integrating personal interviews, deep on-the-ground fieldwork, archival data, as well as, for lack of a better word, more teched-out methods, including, we talked a little bit last night about the use of AI in documentation of some of these devices. Her research has appeared in leading journals of political science, and it's not only this particular project, but also more broadly looking at post-genocide dynamics and politics in the country, including related to gender and representation in the country. So it's a super exciting research agenda on very important topics in a country that probably gets less attention than it should these days. And so we're very glad to welcome Erin Lin. Thanks, Erin.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. It's such an honor to be here. And it's really great to be able to present my research in front of a new set of faces. I also really love speaking to centers that are interested in regional area studies, specific issues, because I actually was a Cambodianist before I became a political scientist. And so you'll notice I have this one country specialty. It really inspires everything that I write about in political science. And I'll talk a little bit more at the end of the talk about why I think one area, one case kind of articles and books are still very important for our field. So as Dave alluded to, this is a relatively new book, and I think it's a really interesting situation to be giving a talk about a relatively new book, because I've had a year since the book has been published, and a couple of things have happened. So first, you're able to go out, talk about the book, and then you're able to kind of get people's reactions to the book. And so now I can I'm kind of more suited to talk to you a little bit more, I don't know if it's aggressively or defensively, about why I think the book matters, the big so what question, in a different way than I kind of covered in the conclusion of my book. And then I also think I can address this kind of now what question, now that I've kind of given you a summary of the book, what do I think are the next steps? So I think this will be my first time giving this structure of talk, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So the chances are, if you've heard anything about the US bombing of Cambodia, these are rather sobering events. And you're probably thinking about the secret bombing of Cambodia during the Vietnam War. Now, the reason why the US bombed both Laos and Cambodia is to cut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So these were supply lines on land. There are more than 6,000 miles of concealed roads that were in the eastern mountains of Laos and Cambodia. And the reason why it was so important to cut off this artery is because we had cut off the naval routes through the Gulf of Tonkin. So this was kind of the main way that the North Vietnamese army were able to strengthen their mobile bases in South Vietnam. And so the way that we address this is that the US fought this war over the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they fought it primarily with bombs. In terms of sheer quantity, in total, we dropped 500,000 tons of explosive ordnance over Cambodia. Just to put this in scale, so like that's more than the combined weight of every man, woman, and child in the country at the time. And historically, in 1 year, one single squadron of B-52s dropped half the tonnage that was dropped by all planes in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. So this was like a much larger scale of aerial warfare than we had seen in the past. And just to kind of underscore like the geographic comparison, so when you think about the country of Cambodia, it's roughly the size of Kentucky and Indiana combined. Yet like the area of Cambodia that we covered is essentially the same spatial equivalent as Kentucky. So that's like kind of the amount that we are covering with our bombs. Now, people have written about the effects of these bombs in the short term. So they've talked about how the immediate destruction killed about 100,000 Cambodians. Some historians believed it led to the political radicalization of Cambodia, attributing the US bombing to the rise of the Khmer Rouge that eventually took over the country and killed about 1/5 of the entire population in a genocide. And so these are all very sad, negative consequences. But what's particularly interesting is that when you talk to development economists, they're actually quite optimistic about how the local economies seem ready to recover soon after that they've been bombed. And the reason that they're optimistic is because there's a lot of empirical cases that suggest a correlation between facing bombing and eventually experiencing long-term economic recovery. The most, I think, applicable case in this scenario is about Vietnam. So there are two Berkeley economists named Ted Miguel and Gerard Roland. And they do a aggregate level study at the district level that examines how district levels of bombing in Vietnam have no impact in the long run in terms of district level population density, poverty, consumption, education, literacy, or like access to electric infrastructure. Now, this is also echoed in our cases of World War II. So when you think about Japan, so there are economists who look at the effects of the atomic bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they find that city sizes soon rebound really quickly after the atomic bombing, because the idea is that labor can be reallocated and there's benefits to resupplying your labor supply in the economy immediately after the war. Now, there are similar economists who look at the 20 largest cities in Germany before World War II. And then they find that all of these cities, they tend to recover in their capital and labor supply despite having been bombed. And so it kind of leads to this question of, well, it turns out that there are certain historical cases in which you see like these industrial urban areas and they're able to recover from bombing. And so it makes you wonder, like, to what degree does this apply to other cases outside of these three main ones that we've studied? Now, there's like a couple of things that I think we can think about at technical level. So the first is that these studies are more macroeconomic. They're more interested in aggregated levels of growth of labor supply. And so it doesn't always mean that those aggregate dimensions transfer down to the individual level. In statistics, we call that an ecological fallacy. You can't infer individual level behavior from aggregate statistics. We actually find that in the Southeast Asian cases, when you look at like household level dynamics, that bombing occasionally does cause poverty traps, or not cause, it really correlates with impoverished households today, but it's not really clear what the mechanisms are. So that is what's motivated this particular study, and that's what motivated me to go to Cambodia. As I mentioned before, I was a Cambodianist before I learned a lot of econometric methods. That's me farming with one of my respondents. And so this is the case in 2018. Northeast province of Cambodia, it borders Vietnam. And she lived there for the past 12 years. And originally she said she was like so excited to like marry into this land. She arrived because her husband's mother had some extra land for them to farm. And she was like, oh, I came here and the land was just great. It's like very soft land in Khmer. It's called Dai Krahom, and it retains water really well. So she didn't actually have to build an irrigation system out for her rice paddies. And it's also quite like nutrient dense. So she doesn't have to apply fertilizer in order to grow things like soybeans and potatoes. But the problem is that like the first time she went out to her land and she tried to clear it, she found like little metal wires that were sticking out, and she didn't know what to make of them. So she asked a neighbor, and the neighbor was like, oh, wait, don't go any closer to the wires. Those are trip wires, and they're part of these cluster bombs that come up where like the cluster bombs fall, and then they'll release these trip wires into the ground. And if you touch them, they trigger and they explode the bomb. At least like that's how the bombs were designed to go off when they were first dropped more than 50 years ago. And it's not always clear if they drop or if they explode, but they do sometimes explode in the villages. And so they're just like, don't go nearby. And this was something that like totally shocked Vannery, because she comes from a town in Prey Veng, which is like closer to Phnom Penh, that's the capital. And her town in Prey Veng, they also had experienced bombing. So her parents had told her stories about what it was like to like survive the US bombing. But she said like she didn't grow up with any unexploded ordnance around. She had seen bomb craters, and people had taken like those bomb craters and turned them into places to raise fish. But she never knew what like cluster bombs look like. She didn't know what carpet bombs look like. And she said, like part of this was probably because the soil in Prey Veng is terrible. Like the place where she lived growing up, it's like super dry, it's super rocky. And this is kind of where the idea of my book and some of my work had started, where it's this idea that bombs actually are designed to go off on impact, but there's a lot of things that happen to the ground that can condition whether or not a bomb successfully detonates. And this is a conditional effect that we should look more at. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an example of a visual sense of what a cluster bomb looks like and how it can be really hard to differentiate if you're on safe land versus unsafe land. And after meeting Vannery, she like took me out because she was like, oh, I actually found a cluster bomb when I was out trying to find mushrooms. Like, do you want to see it? And so we went out, and we found these. And to the left is a rock, and then to the right is a blue 42 cluster bomb that's been hidden in the ground for 50 some years. So you can get this sense like how, first, the blue 42 cluster bomb is the most found piece of explosive ordnance in Cambodia today. And the reason why it was the most found is because it was actually this huge military innovation in like the 1960s and the 1970s. It was invented in the Eglin Air Force Base in Florida. And the reason why it was an innovation is that it could be dropped from above the range of like North Vietnam's like lightest and largest anti-aircraft gun, which is called the it's called the 57 millimeter S-60. And so they had to design some new type of weapon that could be dropped from higher above, and that was this type of cluster bomb. So now, like, and to give a perspective of the amount of these cluster bombs that we dropped over Cambodia, we dropped 7 for every man, woman, and child that lived in the country at that time. So it's kind of no wonder that we're still finding a lot of these unexploded ordnance left on the ground. So this picture shows how it's really hard to differentiate between rocks and between cluster bombs. And that caused Vannery to really shift the way she approached farming. So she like learned how to farm from her parents. She knew how to like use an undated rice paddy. She knew how to plant rice, to grow it, how to till land. And now she's completely shifted how she grows rice. So first, she only uses hand tools. She doesn't want to use machines, and that's to leave a light footprint on the ground. Basically, will like use machetes to hack away weeds. She won't use tractors. She also avoids large segments of her land, like land that she has seen trigger wires before, she won't go back to. And she ends up just farming this really narrow strip around her house called a jamga. That's like a kind of like a household garden. And then she also uses no-till methods. And so that's actually an example of what we were doing before there. That's like a no-till method for rice. Technically, that's an indigenous method of growing rice in Cambodia, where you just like make a tiny hole and you put a rice grain on the ground. So you grow less rice that way, but it obviously is less invasive to the ground than using tillers to disturb the soil and planting more rice in those rows. So she has these kind of short-term adjustments that she's done to stay safe. And I think we can kind of transfer that into, like, I would say more economic language or more abstract language to think about how this impacts household poverty. So I think it really suggests that we need to pay attention to like the individual's environment, like the individual's risk environment, and how it impacts like 2 particular outcomes. Like the first is an individual's time horizon. So the degree to which the time over which they evaluate the utility of particular economic activities. And then we also need to think about how this impacts the individual's willingness to invest, particularly in things like in activities that pose this immediate burden on your safety, and the return is like long-term and uncertain. So this is what leads me to kind of rethinking bombing's long-term effects. So remember before I told you what these economists who studied Germany and Japan and Vietnam had said, like they had found this correlation between like labor growth rates, capital growth rates, and bombing. Well, like the theory that undergirds these correlations is neoclassical growth theory. This idea that like bombing can destroy capital and can disrupt labor, but economies are going to recover quickly because there are these high marginal returns to investment. So there's going to be high rates of making money and like achieving productivity after destruction occurs. So people are incentivized to rebuild. Now, the book's argument is slightly different because it's really talking more about the scope conditions and we should expect neoclassical growth theory to work. Because think more about where these cases are and like the types of bombs that were used and targeted. So in World War II, we were targeting mostly like urban industrial areas. The bombings in Cambodia were different. These are indiscriminate. This is covering agricultural areas. And so the theories that we need are probably going to be different. Also, like the bombs that were highly destructive over World War II were destroying a lot of capital. They're destroying a lot of people, labor supplies, people were dying. We don't really have theories that talk about what happens if land is destroyed. And so that's what this book is trying to do. It's trying to fill in these other gaps by looking at other stories and saying that, you know, what we have right now doesn't necessarily explain some of the trends that we see in other countries. So what I've done so far is kind of built up a little bit of a theoretical story based on like one case, right? This is Venery, and she finds that where she lives in Ratnakiri, where the soil is very soft and fertile, you have a lot of bombs that fail to go off. Then we also have this idea that where she's from, where the land is more infertile, where the land is harder, you have more detonated bombs, right? So there's a conditional effect based on like land quality, and that should provide an estimate of your exposure to unexploded ordnance. So that's kind of like the basic conditional effect that we're looking at. So in Southeast Asia, we need to think about how a lot of the food that is grown is primarily rice, and they're grown in rice paddies. So it's really the softest land that tends to be the most productive. The issue is that that's exactly where bombs fail to detonate, on the soft land, on the flooded rice paddies, in areas where like the land is so fertile you can grow rice year round, so there's always going to be a cushion of rice plants for these bombs to fall on. You should find more unexploded bombs in the most fertile areas of Cambodia compared to the less fertile areas of Cambodia that are super rocky, and those bombs should go off immediately. Now, this kind of highlights this irony, right? Because that means that once you bomb high fertility land, you're actually removing the fertility advantage. And so this is like a hypothesis, at least, that we can test. But we'll have to then transition from our methods, from using ethnographic methods and anecdotal ones, to see if any of these trends actually scale up beyond that. And so that's what I try to do in like the one most teched up chapter of my book. I create this data set where I use US Air Force declassified records of payload drops. It's actually the payload drop coordinates and the contents of each payload, so in terms of weight and the number of bombs. I'm able to match that with what the local ground conditions are at the time, and this is from the Ministry of Agricultural records, where the Ministry of Ag actually went out to all of these villages and took all these localized soil samples to then create estimates of like what areas are low, medium fertility, high fertility in Cambodia, and maps of soil type. And then I'm able to merge these two things with a Ministry of Agriculture census, as well as Cambodia socioeconomic survey. And like this can provide like plot level data of like where plots are located in Cambodia, the amount of the plot that is owned compared to the amount of the plot that is actually used, as well as the amount of rice or other types of agricultural goods that are produced from the plot. What's cool about the agricultural census is that I'm also able to estimate things like the amount of money that is produced, that's generated from like livestock sales, from fish sales. So I can kind of see if people are transitioning from agricultural productivity to other types of, from crop-based productivity to other types of animal-based productivity. And then the cherry on top is that I also add what are called like pre-treatment control variables. So this is to help kind of think of these alternative explanations or reasons why bombs might be targeted more in like high fertility areas that are already high productivity. With these pre-treatment variables, I'm able to measure like what productivity was like before the bombing to see like the differential between the before and the after. And what's interesting is that like the US Army actually provides all of these really densely scaled topographic maps that they use to plan land emissions into potentially Cambodia. They did this for Laos and Vietnam as well. And so like that actually gives you like very direct population density. They had little dots for every household in the village, and they had mapped out like the parts of the village that were actively growing rice versus the parts that were actively barren. So I'm able to use that map information and code it to generate my pre-treatment control variables. Okay, so this is really quick because the econometric analysis stuff tends to be pretty boring. And I'll just say quickly that I have, I run an OLS fixed effect model that interacts like bombing intensity and land fertility. And so that's how I'm able to estimate a differential effect between like the effect of bombing on low fertility land compared to high fertility land. And I try to do other things that control for like a lot of the alternative explanations. So there's like kind of a dummy variable that you put in for like a price zone. So you're controlling for like kind of confounding regional differences in differences in like wages, labor availability, input costs, things like that. And for anyone who has like a more economist bent in the room, I don't know if that applies to anyone here, but there's always this question of like, is this causal inference? So a lot of social scientists are obsessed with trying to prove causation, trying to say that like, well, what you're suggesting is correlative evidence, and that's very interesting, but how can we say with certainty that like what this variable, this historical variable that you're pointing to actually led to this outcome that we're seeing today? And the way we usually solve this problem is through coming up with like a causal identification strategy. That means that there's some type of randomization that occurs that is like causing your treatment, and because it's randomly applied, it's kind of like a randomized control trial that you see in the medical field, then you're able to kind of observe this natural experiment play out in the real world. Now, I think people see this setup and they're like, oh, well, you're studying something unintended, right? Like you're studying like these unintended bomb failures, and so that's probably your cause of randomization. And this is when I want to say up front that it's not a perfectly randomized story, right? Because first, bombing isn't random. Like bombing is typically targeted to places where the U.S. military thought, as Nixon once said, like the bamboo Pentagon exists. Like they were targeting places where they thought there were like strong communist support and infrastructural like bases. That being said, they also were kind of indiscriminately bombing large swaths of area because they wanted to show like the strength of U.S. military power and how this will continue to get applied over time, which is trying to force concessions from the communists. So I will take that bombing itself is not random, but what I will say is the bomb failure will depend on ground conditions and not Air Force strategy. And so that's where I'm saying that like therefore we can say that unexploded ordnance exposure is accidental. And so that's why we can make this comparison between exposed areas and non-exposed areas. So exposed areas are the high fertility bombed areas compared to the non-exposed areas, which would be the high fertility non-bombed areas. But you can also make a comparison between like the low fertility areas, those that have been bombed and those that have not been bombed, because there in that comparison, there should be no effect since the bombs would explode in the low fertility areas. All right, so I'm just going to jump to the findings. Now, what we see here, I'll just kind of briefly walk you through how to interpret an econometric output. So you see on the y-axis, that's the estimate of like the effect size. The dotted line, that's 0. So if the line touches 0, that means that there isn't an effect documented. So what we're doing is that we're estimating the effect of bombing on 2 different types of land, on low fertility land and high fertility land. So you'll see that on all of the low fertility columns, so that's on the left-hand side of each bar plot, you see that the line is touching 0. That means statistically there's a null effect with the low fertility land, and that fits with our theory that in low fertility land there should be no effect of bombing because all the bombs have detonated. So so these areas are safer to farm, and you can kind of farm as if normal today. Now on the right-hand side, you'll see that those all the high fertility effect sizes, and you'll see that those are all negative, and they're not touching the lines. That means that those are negative, statistically significant effects. So that means that across these 5 variables, we see that bombing has a negative and statistically significant effect across the amount of rice harvested per plot, across the amount of the square meter of rice harvested, or the square meter of land harvested. That's like the absolute amount, but then I also looked at like the total, the relative amount of land, the percentage of land that is used per plot. It also has a negative effect on whether or not the household actually invests in agricultural machines, as well as the amount of rice that they sell to market. So that's like the visual, that's how like you can kind of do the eye test, but then I put it down substantively. So like I find that exposure to unexploded bombs leads to like a 44% decline in rice market sales, a 2/3 drop in rice production, a 40% drop in household income. So this is actually this is outcomes on a second regression table that I don't show because I don't like messy slides. And then an 80% decline in fish sales and more than a 50% drop in like livestock and poultry sales. So it's kind of like this unexploded ordinance leads to just like depressed economic activity everywhere. It's not just about crops and farming, it's also about other types of investments you can make on your land. So I'll just like briefly talk about like the takeaways from this, because this is only like one chapter of the book. But the first thing I wanted to point out is that bombing is actually a composite intervention, but historically we've thought of it in the field of political science and economics as just like a single intervention, right? It's a bomb, it explodes, it destroys things, it kills people, it might mess you, like it could mess you up psychologically, but like we don't think about things beyond the impact of that explosion. I'm arguing that yes, like there is an event in which the bomb is dropped, and I think both going through an actual bomb raid and then also having to go through bomb explosions is like traumatic and scary. But there's a secondary effect, this latent effect of bombing that exists for some people, and those are the people who have to live amongst the unexploded ordnance. And so it's important for us just to unpack these effects and make sure we don't compress them together or forget about them. The second thing I have mentioned before, which is that bombing actually creates this reversal of fortune, because it makes the most valuable land in Cambodia, the most fertile land, unworkable. And the reason why that is the last point that I say. And it's because like rumors of finding an unexploded bomb triggers the sphere of fear. So there has these psychological effects that are actually larger in like scale than like the bomb's immediate blast radius. And so what's really scary about this is like kind of the psychological transformative effects. Like you're turning from like one story or from hearing like an instance of a neighbor finding bombs nearby, you're effectively turning these confident farmers into very cautious ones. And what happens when you're a really cautious farmer is that you make these little small-term adjustments in your behavior to stay safe. But the problem is that like these adjustments accumulate over time, and they end up leading to this long-term poverty that we see in the econometric analysis. And so over the long term, we see pretty substantial rates of underproduction of these high fertility bombed areas. We see evidence of food insecurity and household poverty in these areas. So that is one chapter. And if I was just presenting like that one article, like I think everyone gets, well, it's very sad. But at the same time, I think it also like doesn't tell a deeper story of Cambodian politics, and it kind of compresses history. Like there's a lot of stuff that happens in between, like the time I'm measuring agricultural output and the bombings. And so like that's one of the beauty of books is that like you're able to like the reader kind of leans in and they're like, tell me more, and then you're able to use the rest of the chapters to kind of flesh out what some of the other stories are, what some of the like cultural impacts, the social impacts, and the political impacts of unexploded ordnance are. So like I'll briefly talk about them just to give you a little taste, but I'm happy to kind of go in more detail in the Q&A. Because like the chapter that follows this kind of economic story is really about how unexploded ordnance impacts the social life of like one multi-ethnic community, one multi-ethnic village in Cambodia, where I was able to do some ethnographic observation. And it's in this village where you have like one hamlet, that's the Khmer, that's the ethnic majority in Cambodia, and then you have another hamlet that is populated with the Tampuan, who are an indigenous tribe. And what I find is that like they manage their risk of unexploded ordnance differently, based on like what they have access to. So like the Khmer speak the dominant language, Khmer, and they have very close relations with the humanitarian demining organization that works in this area. So they essentially have this like monopoly on like they're able to phone right away when a Khmer person finds an unexploded bomb, and like they're able to bring in this professionalized team. It's called an explosive ordnance disposal team, an EOD team, to come and like try to remove bombs for them on demand. Now they also will say things like there's evidence of social tension between the Khmer and the Tampuan, and that's largely like just I think a way to show how like unexploded ordnance, it almost reminded me of like coronavirus. I was writing this book at the time of COVID, where it felt like other people's masking decisions was just a way to judge people who like kind of disagree with you, or amplify social tensions that might have existed already within a family or within a community. And I find that unexploded ordnance was really similar to that, where it's like the Khmer were judging the Tampuan for saying like they're handling unexploded ordnance in this really kind of unsafe way. Like they told stories and rumors of like Tampuan children taking cluster bombs and throwing them to each other like baseballs. And they're like, oh, Khmer people don't do that. We know the phone number. And they actually like didn't mention how they're monopolizing access to the humanitarian group, compared to the indigenous, the Tampuan, and they were saying, well, the Khmer people aren't to be trusted. Like even if they had information, why would we ever like think that like what they're trying to do is to help us? And instead, the Tampuan was like, plus, like we have our own information because we lived here during the bombing, so we actually remember like where the planes were flying over. Like we know the areas like that were former battlefields, and so it's actually like more helpful. It's like we have our own information to stay safe, and we don't have to rely on the Khmer to actually manage our own risk. And so like what this actually shows is how like the social relations between the Khmer and Tampuan are a product of mistrust that had existed for decades, even before the US bombing. But this was like another way that these tensions are existing. And social conflict kind of arising in the form of like rumors and distrust. So that's a taste of the third chapter. The fourth chapter is kind of aimed at those who have, I think, more of like a liberal humanitarian bent, right? And so it's this idea that like you hear these stories or you see this quantitative evidence about the negative impacts of unexploded ordnance. You hear that, there aren't necessarily like straightforward social solutions in trying to keep people safe or to like remove unexploded ordnance. And so instead, like, what should we do? Like, how does demining work? And how do we better kind of allocate our resources to try to remove unexploded ordnance? And so the first thing that I try to do in this chapter is explain to you visually like what it's like to be in a minefield and why the process of demining is so hard and time consuming and costly. And there's like multiple steps in the demining process, and I like to highlight in the chapter how I think the way we usually imagine a minefield is like a sandbox full of dirt. and like all you need to do is like come up with some device that will like set off all the landmines, and then the area will be safe. How a minefield actually looks is like a completely unweeded yard, right? It's like full of brush. I mean, it's kind of hard to walk through already. That's why so many people talk about they discover bombs when they're clearing land. And that's actually the most dangerous part of finding unexploded, or of trying to locate unexploded ordnance, is you have to pull out all of the plants in order for any type of detection equipment that you have to work. And so like that is kind of the most dangerous step that most people who try to invent new technologies to find like unexploded bombs or landmines kind of don't realize. Like if you've never been to a minefield, you never realize that like that the clearance step is the hardest one. But they've actually developed, I think both in the US military and also locally, ways to like remote control bulldozers and cranes to pull out this land, and that's where a lot of the ordnance actually gets detonated. So that's a pretty dangerous process. Then, like once you have this kind of like construction site where all of the ground has been removed, then you can have an array of tools. So there's dogs and rats that sniff out TNT. So if things are relatively close to the surface, like that works especially well for landmines. What's hard about unexploded ordnance and the particular type, like environment that we're operating with in Cambodia is that we're working in like inundated rice paddies or places where there's a lot of alluvial floods. So you actually have like both buildup of soil over time that'll like increase the amount of soil that you have to go through. But at the same time, you also have churn. So you have like water coming in that sometimes removes some of the topsoil off, that exposes new soil that has not seen the light of day before. So that's why like the problem of unexploded ordnance actually feels like a perennial problem, because of the way the topsoil movement occurs. Like you still have people like Manari finding that like bomb where the mushrooms are, right? Because you have more and more like stuff that's coming up to the surface. So that is like how tricky the detection process is. But the good news is that we've developed different types of radar systems, different types of metal detection that can help the process. So now like this is a version of a large loop that this deminer is pushing through, and that actually provides like a kind of a 3D image of what the shape is of the thing that you're detecting, which is good because that way you can differentiate like false positives from true bombs. Because where there have been a lot of battlefields, there's also a lot of scrap metal because you have ammunition, you have bombs that have detonated, so you have shards of other weapons around. And it used to be that like that used to waste a lot of time for deminers because they'd have to treat every false positive as like a true bomb. So that is to say that like the hardest and the most stressful part about bomb removal and landmine removal is the actual literal digging out. So you like have now located where the unexploded ordnance is, but then you have to by hand dig out the area. And that's something that like they've really struggled finding some robotic or machine way to try to dig out, because it's like there's a delicacy. It's like it's trying to use machines to replace surgeons. Like you have to be very delicate, like you have to be very cognizant if there's like stones or rocks and things in between that you also have to remove. And so there has not been like a technological solution to essentially what is the most dangerous part of the removal process. So like that's kind of the first part of the chapter. The second part is kind of the big irony that occurs, where once land in Cambodia has been cleared, it becomes highly valuable, safe, fertile land. And the problem, I think, when we try to devise like policies to increase the safety and the secure livelihood of community stakeholders, is that sometimes these policies are absent the politics in which the policies are occurring. And so that's kind of the case in Cambodia, where you kind of, throw people out of the frying pan and into the fire, because the politics in Cambodia, it's highly kleptocratic. There's a very weak judicial system, and there's already a high risk, or there's already a strong precedent of land grabbing. And so what has been anecdotally happening is that kleptocratic elites associated with the state and higher levels of government have been taking this land that is now safe and figuring out legal loopholes to basically acquire it and turn it into their own private property to make like large-scale commercial agricultural plantations for them. And this falls in line with like what formal theorists have observed in different types of civilizations, where it's really the most economically attractive land that ends up becoming the most geopolitically vulnerable. And it kind of leads to this question of responsibility, like how much of it is our responsibility to just clear unexploded ordinance that we might have left behind, even without taking into account the other types of political conditions that don't actually improve the livelihoods of the people that we aim to help. And so that's how the book kind of transitions from, I think, the last chapter that, again, leads on a little bit of a negative note, but thinks about like what are our obligations, like as Americans, as scholars, to really try to, I think, provide data that flesh out some of these important trends that we otherwise would know very little about. And like how do we use our skills as academics to actually potentially better other people's lives. So that's how the book ends. But as I said earlier, I kind of want to talk a little bit about where I see this book in relation to other pieces in political science. So what I'll say really quickly is that like one thing I've noticed just from presenting this is that there are some skeptics who say like, this is really interesting, this is very sad, but it's just a single case study, right? And I don't know what to make of it. And this is a common complaint about the legacies of war literature, of which I'm part of. And like it's kind of classified as like a field in which everyone throws a brick. And so you just have a lot of kind of like, bricks of information around, and there's no theoretical framework to combine it to make people discuss it with one another. And I think another way to think about this problem is that we have like very narrow empirical questions, and we talk about them in very narrow empirical settings. I think like another skeptical way you can receive this research is like, okay, you're just telling me that history matters. Like that's kind of trivial. We all know that like aspects of history can matter, and the question is like what aspects and like why do these effects persist? And I think this is really tricky to answer because like the results of all of these studies are so context specific, right? So you think about like how I'm telling you the story about like cluster bombs. Well, cluster bombs are like a weapon of a particular time period. So like they existed, the second generation that I studied a lot in Cambodia, like that didn't exist, that generation didn't exist in World War II. So it's almost hard to make that comparison then between like Germany and Japan. And also like the ways that we targeted our weapons were completely different. In Germany and Japan, it was more industrial targets. It was urban targets. And then in the Cambodian case, as well as Vietnam and Laos, that's like indiscriminate. So like how can we make these comparisons across our bricks? Like are our bricks actually related to each other at all? And that's like a really tricky thing to figure out because when you think about like the course of history, like the entire path of history is impossible to enumerate in a book that is really about like one phase of history related to another phase. And so the question is like, what do we do? What do we do? And I think this is where I think I see potential solutions. And the first is that we need to think about what is empirically rigorous besides just things that are really well causally identified. And this might be like a complaint that I'm directing mostly to the political scientists in the room, because it's something that we are definitely incentivized to be trained in and be good at and be published in our top journals. We have to be very good at thinking about like the best ways to show a causal relationship between two variables. And right now, that's gold standard is like finding some source of randomization. And like this is what's getting published in our top journals. I think like the problem of that, if like that is how we're defining empirically rigorous work, is that like it also it neglects to kind of fill out this like story that I think only area studies can. And this is because like when you think about how this work is structured, you're forcibly compressing history. So as I said before, you're looking at one particular historic event and then you're looking how decades or even centuries later it impacts outcomes. And that means you're ignoring all of the history in between. And we don't really know how like those intervening years can actually maybe sustain the effects or potentially even erode them. But like there's no space to discuss that in like the 10,000 words limit that we have in our journals. And like the way that most people try to address this question is through what they call mechanisms of persistence. So can you provide like any type of like qualitative information or even quantitative information about like why these particular effects will carry through throughout the decades. So you'll notice that in like my particular work, it's kind of assuming just like a environmental physical legacy, like the bombs are just still going to be there throughout the decades. And I try to make the argument that the information and capital needed to actually remove all of those bombs, the costs are so high that they're just literally impossible to remove at scale for these past 50 years. Now, I kind of see the point of research to be in a more like interpretive angle. So I really liked Clifford Geertz's quote that talks about like the point of research isn't to answer certain questions decisively. Instead, it's to really make available to us answers that other people, like guarding other sheep in other valleys, have given. And like what we need to do is like go to those valleys, like interview those sheep, I guess, and like see what those stories are, and they can help us understand. I think the diversity of effects that we see around the world. But the only way to do that is to really deeply know your area and really deeply know your case. So in terms of like thinking about what to do and where to go next, I think there's actually a lot of excitement for like all of the students in the room. So like first, like this topic of like legacies of war, how to like unpack the effects of violence and civil conflict. This is like a huge topic in political science right now. So looking back in like the latest issue of the APSR, in every issue, either a half or a third of the comparative politics articles are about the legacies of war. Even the CP, I think, associate editor of the AJPS was saying how like this topic was one of the top 3 that people are publishing in nowadays. But I think there's like a modal way that people are studying this, and it's this tendency where we just like tend to harvest natural experiments to test these like theoretical claims. The problem is that like we kind of force this version of history in which like the dominant role is things like or accidental events, and that's sometimes how history plays out. But I think we lose a lot outside of that. And so I suggest like instead of just thinking of political science more like this narrowly as a bunch of kind of nifty econometric articles, let's think about it more widely. Let's really try to invest time reading books that tell the reader more. So that's why I gave examples of Volya Charnish's newest book, where she does something similar, where she looks at different types of displacement that occurs after World War II in Poland and Germany, and shows how this impacts like social cooperation today. And she does that through both archival historical work as well as through econometric work. And I also really like Adam Lerner's book, and he's more of an empirical political theorist, and he goes case by case to think about the role that collective trauma plays in building international institutions. And so I think we need to like kind of reorient ourselves in thinking the importance of books that tell readers more about like the years in between the events, and also devolve into more of writing articles that actually ground truth, the theory that you're trying to share, like with individual stories, with actually proof that exists, rather than just looking at the statistical correlation. So that is like kind of the now. That's how I'm answering the now what, but I'm happy to answer other questions about where, who, why, all the other things in the Q&A. Thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thanks so much, Erin. We have time for questions, and I'm happy to pass the mic around for that. Who'd like to get us started? Sure. Introduce yourself briefly.
Hey, I'm Justin Mogg, the Sustainability Director here. It seems like your econometric analysis has come up with a way for us to at least put a little bit of a price tag on this for reparations, right? Is that ever part of the thinking about how we might repair these harms in the future, and how we might have some reasonable number to put on it? I'm also just really fascinated by that 80% impact on the fish sales. Tell me more about that. How come the biggest impact of this is on fishing?
That's interesting. I've never gotten the fish question before. I think it's 2 things. So first, like the way the way fishing works in Cambodia is it's river-based. So, I mean, people do occasionally turn bomb craters into ponds and try to produce fish, but that's a very different kind of fish. It's catfish. So, like, catfish don't, I don't know if there are any catfish fans here. Like, it's a pretty cheap fish, right? And that's not going to be this. That's not going to yield the same profit as a high-quality river fish. There's like a really good fish called snakefish that looks like a snake, but it has really nice, tender white meat. And so that you always have to like traverse land and go to a river to access. And so that's probably what's happening there, where like people have the inability to access rivers with the same ease that they had before, and so they're unable to engage in what are the more high profit types of fishing. Yeah.
I've heard of growing fish in rice paddies, but
Yeah.
that's not what we're talking about.
No, the growing fish, like if you want to grow fish in a rice paddy, it's also going to be a catfish variant. So a lot of the catfish, like people usually just, they produce for their own household consumption, and it's not profitable enough to try to produce at scale for selling at market. And they don't sell super well at market anyway, because most people just eat the ones that they have in their houses. Yeah. And then your first question about reparations is really interesting, because I have conspiracy theory, which is that like one question that I sometimes get when I present this research is like, what about the environmental effects of unexploded ordnance? So you have bombs that sit in the soil for 50 years. They're full of TNT, RDX. There's also like heavy metals that are part of the bomb. Like, is there evidence of this impacting like the quality of the plants, the quality of the water that comes out? And this is really hard to test. It's very expensive to test. And I've been in conversation with like the Buffett Foundation. So like Howard Buffett, the brother or son, I guess, of Warren, has a weird obsession with landmines. And so he's actually taken like areas of his farm in Iowa, I think, or Indiana. Sorry, I feel bad confusing the two. And planted landmines and try to see if there's like evidence of like leakage coming out. But what's really hard is that like this type of environmental impact study requires a lot of specialized equipment that usually you need to run through an academic setting or academic institution in order to have the access to that capital and then actually implant into your soil and take continuous measures. Because like the problem, as you can kind of allude to in like this research that has anything to do in the environment, is that the environment is very different across like all places that you could operate. And so when you do an environmental impact study, you not only have to think about the particularities of the soil type that you're working in, but also the way water moves back and forth in the soil. And so that's why you need to run these like tests with continuous measures to understand how like water flow changes throughout the day and also throughout the seasons. And so in the end, like to do these types of studies, it costs like $8 to $10 million because it's a multi-site, multi-year study with high cost capital equipment. And like I have a colleague at Mines Advisory Group who has a conspiracy theory that like that's one reason why like the US government doesn't want to fund these types of projects, like even through like say NSF, because like you could start making the case that there's like more impacts that we should be like paying for, and the environmental remediation is just not something that we're prepared to work on, because we don't even give that much money to humanitarian demining. So.
Hi, Nanting Cho from Economics Department.
Oh.
I think this is an excellent research. What, in terms of the econometrics analysis, what is the sample period, and also how many counties or areas you have in that particular analysis?
So there's 4,000 agricultural plots that are represented across about 300 villages. And then this also is coming from about 360 households. And then the time span, so the contemporary outcomes were taken from surveys or census data from 2012 or 2014. And then the time span of like say the bombing data, that's like the payload, the aggregate payloads for, like over each village and plot. that war from 1965 to 1973, the majority of the U.S. bombing over Cambodia actually takes place in a 3-year time period from 1970 to 1973.
I have a second question. Based on your analysis, what would you recommend to be effective treatment of this problem?
Effective treatment for the unexploded ordinance problem?
Yeah, and its impact on the economics and people's life.
Yeah, it's hard because I think if you think of the problem purely as an issue of unexploded bombs and personal safety, then the solution is quite clear, right? It's like dedicate more money to demining. I think the problem is that I think many of us are more motivated towards creating environments where the victims of unexploded ordnance feel safe again and have access to their land again. And if that's the case, then we have to, again, think about the political context in which we're giving back this reclaimed land. And this is really hard because I would say, like, I try to be pretty honest and upfront about, like, how the last chapter ends, where it's like, listen, this is not a thorough, complete investigation of all instances of land being given back. And so all I've been able to do is kind of point out certain instances in which the respondents feel comfortable enough with me to tell me some of the terrible things that have happened to them. But I don't know if this is representative of the average person, or if this is a relatively rare event. And like, I do that terrible thing that I used to hate when I would read this in books, where it's kind of like, then you have to think about, like, what is the role for future research, and how, like, I think ideally it would be really good to think of ways to, like, systematically try to collect some of this, like, land reclamation data to understand, like, how large is this problem where land is being actively taken from people who have cleared land, and then think about, at least, like, theoretically, like, why? Like, if there is variation, why are some people safe? Why are some people not safe? Does it mostly have to do with political affiliation, who you voted for in the past, who your village chief is in the past? Or is it like a purely economic greed story where it's like people with truly the best located and the most valuable land will get their land taken from them? So I think these are still open research questions, but what's really important is that, like, they just need to be done. And I think one thing that I learned from doing this project is that, like, most organizations and institutions don't have, like, the time, skill set, or bandwidth to do this type of research. Like, you think about the military, and the military is a very operations-based organization. So you go and you give them a task to destroy a particular target, to inflict to output a certain number of bombs to show a message, and they do it, and they come back, and when they write a bomb damage assessment, it's all about how well they achieve that mission. It has nothing to do with, like, the unintended consequences of, like, what their mission is. And so, like, there's no one in the military whose job it is to look at this, even though they might have, like, the best sources of data to look at it. But then you also think about the humanitarian world, and, like, their incentives also aren't aligned in the same way. Where, I mean, I think it's very similar to, like, the policy world. And you see there's not a lot of time. There's not a lot of time to invest in, like, developing the research skills that you might need to study this question from multiple angles with multiple types of data. And so, like, the only people who can answer these questions are, like, graduate students and, like, academics, because, like, they're the only ones who can invest the time in learning the language, invest the time in, like, learning the econometric methods, invest the time in developing, like, relationships with their respondents. No, to, like, learn these skills, because, like, if they don't do it, then, like, no one else will do this research. So that's kind of, like, my inspirational part of the talk. Yes.
After so many years, do you have any data to claim how much of the land have been declared as clear?
Yeah, so this is where it gets tricky, because the way contaminated land is classified is that there's different types of zones. So the zones are determined by the expected density of where you should find a lot of unexploded ordnance, and where you think you should find, like, they exist, but they're in trace amounts. there's been a movement in the Cambodian government to rapidly try to clear like the low activity areas, because that way you can like release statistics that make it sound like, oh, half of the contaminated areas are clear. So that's exactly what's happening. Where the Cambodian government, they're kind of in charge of having the teams of like German shepherds and dogs like find the unexploded ordinance in the ground, and so they can kind of clear land en masse. I think there's questions to actually how well they're doing this and how much of this is just kind of like a public relations play. Because again, going back to the politics of Cambodia, the unexploded ordinance issue is a very convenient story for Hun Sen, who right now has been anti-US for a while, except can be pro-Trump occasionally. And so anytime they find like a massive carpet bomb, this always makes national news, because he likes to point out like, this is what the U.S. did to us. Like our national demining organization found it, and like this is how the U.S. like owes us more money. So that's why like people don't always like to trust the national statistics, because they tend to be inflated and compared to the international humanitarian groups that then focus on the highest, the most dangerous areas, and also the on-demand areas that people phone in to ask for help. So it's kind of a foggy way to answer your question, but right now the estimate is that if Cambodia continues to receive the same amount of aid that it's been receiving to fund their mine removal processes, it'll take about 200 years to remove all of the ordnance.
This will probably be our last question for now, and I'm sure Erin can answer questions after too.
And because there's so much bombing there, 500,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
Tons of bombings. How does this impact on the relations between Cambodia and the United States? Do they hate the United States for what they did or whatever? You know, because as far as I know that the Cambodia situation nowadays is not too good, and they have electronic fraud.
Mm-hmm.
I heard that a large percentage of the country's GDP was generated through this kind of deception.
Yeah.
And also recently there is a scandal that the Prime Minister
Oh,
of Cambodia,
the phone call.
the Prime Minister of Thailand,
Mm-hmm.
into saying something that was indecent, and she resigned out of this.
Yeah.
So I was wondering whether this mess have anything to do with U.S. involvement in the area. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the incident. So there actually for the past 20 years has always been border hostility over Prey Bahia at the border of Thailand and Cambodia. This is just an instance in which it has recently become militarized again, and resulting in the deaths of people near the borders of both Thailand and Cambodia. And then in, was it June? What happened was that the Thai Prime Minister was taped by, we assume, Hun Sen, who's the Prime Minister of Cambodia, for calling him like a deferential term for uncle. And it just suggests that like while these two countries are supposed like public facing kind of in this hostile battle, it made Thailand look very deferential and weak to Cambodia. And so that tape was released, which eventually led to her ousting. So there's been a lot of backstabbing kind of back. I mean, that like for Cambodianists, actually that surprised a lot of us because Hun Sen has always been very close to Thaksin, and so it was very confusing about why he would kind of like retreat back on that relationship when the two of them had kind of been hand in hand in supporting each other's regimes. And so the guess we all have is that he made some kind of deal with the Thai military, and that's why he decided to release the tape. That's just about politics. So the question is, how does this impact U.S. relations? So what's weird is that, like when I've done research in Cambodia, like people, can see that I'm Asian, but then like I make it pretty upfront that I also like my university's in the U.S. and I have never been treated badly. And I think part of that is due to the fact that like in the late 1990s to the 2000s, like the U.S. invested a lot in Cambodia. So this was part of like rebuilding the country after the genocide. it was kind of seen as one of the showcases of the potential of democracy. So we invested a lot in democracy building and trying to support free speech and building kind of these independent newspaper organizations, as well as support for like oppositional political parties. And there was a fair amount of investment too into mobilizing women and having them kind of rise up and become economically independent outside of the patriarchal networks that they usually live in. And so I do think some of this like soft power like impacted the degree to which like Cambodians perceive the U.S. And it's in the, like kind of the same, I'm sure like a similar nuanced way that Germans and Japanese perceive the U.S., you know, like there's economic partnership today and there's a lot of economic cooperation, and that just makes makes the relationship between those countries and a perpetrator of violence just a little bit more complicated. So like when I do work with my respondents, they seem pretty clear, like they're very practical. So they're like, yeah, we know like the US bombed us, but like those pilots are all dead. The US like gives us stuff and we need this stuff. And so if like anything that we can like let us tell the stories so that way like you can try to convince more people to give money and the US to participate more in unexploded ordinance removal. So I don't know if there's a direct line between like experiencing the US bombing and the unexploded ordinance and anti-American sentiment, but where I do see it is in places where the bombings were actually paired with like direct artillery fire. So like instances in which certain villages were bombed thoroughly, and then people will tell stories of like, yeah, and then like I was on a bike and I was like riding home, and then like a plane shows up right behind me and just starts shooting at me, and it's like, why are you trying to attack me? I'm just like a kid trying to go home. And so like those are the people who are like, the US really sucks. But then the people who faced kind of more indiscriminate bombings or mostly experienced the bombing through surviving a bombing raid will usually say something a little bit more tempered, where it's like, I didn't know the pilots. I don't really feel a lot of ill will towards those people.
Great. All right. Well, maybe we can one more time thank Erin Lynn for being here with us today. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dave.
Yep. And for everybody here and who may be watching this later, we'll have more events coming up in the coming weeks. So keep an eye, as always, on the website, which may be relaunching shortly. We'll see how that goes. But also, more importantly, the social media feeds on Facebook, X, or Blue Sky, which will be in their current form and might be more reliable for the next few weeks. So thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.